Welcome to Simpler Bible, a daily journey to biblical understanding. Welcome to episode 9. Today we are in chapters 16 and 17 of Genesis, and we're going to talk about Hagar and Ishmael, and we're going to talk about circumcision. I don't know what you were planning on talking about today, what you had in mind today, but who doesn't need to talk about circumcision from time to time, right? It concerns us all, right? We all have opinions on it. And so here we are today, Hagar, Ishmael, and circumcision. Now, you'll remember yesterday we talked about how God made a covenant to Abraham, said to Abraham, it's going to be through your heir, your son, through whom the world will be blessed. And what we're going to find here is that Abraham gets a little bit impatient. We are not given a time frame here. So Abraham is called by God in chapter 12 when he's 75 years old. And at the beginning of this story, he's about 85. And so we're trying to figure out, we don't know how much time has passed between chapters 15 and 16, but he's grown impatient. And let's pick up in chapter 16:1. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, I know we know them as Abraham and Sarah, and I promise you I'm still going to read it that way at some point, but they have not been renamed yet. Now Sarai, Abraham's wife, had borne him no children. She had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar. Hagar is important, keep that in mind. Sarai said to Abraham, behold now, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go unto my servant that it may be that I shall obtain children by her. And Abraham listened to the voice of Sarai. So after Abraham had lived 10 years in the land, so now we know he's 85, all right? 85 years old, if that matters to you. I like the timeline, I like the dates. Maybe that doesn't matter to you, but Abraham's 85 now. After he had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abraham's wife, took Hagar, her Egyptian maidservant, and gave her to Abram, her husband, as a wife. And Abram went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. So Hagar gets pregnant, and now she's like, hey, I'm better than you. And she hates Sarai. Sarai's not going to like that very much, as we see here in verse 5. Sarai said to Abram, may the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my servant to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me. This has always been to me a funny verse. No deep theology here for you that I can think of, but Sarai is the one who gives her servant to Abram and says, here, we're not having any kids. We got to hurry along this promise of God. Why don't you sleep with my servant? Abraham sleeps with the servant, gets the servant pregnant. The servant starts making fun of Sarah, and now Sarah's coming back to Abraham going, how dare you? I give you my servant, and you have a child with her, and now there's contempt for me, and she's upset. And it's, understandable that she's upset, but it's also kind of like, this was your idea. So anyway, I've always thought that was funny. Look at verse 6. But Abram said to Sarai, behold, your servant is in your power. Do to her as you please. So Sarai dealt harshly with her, and she fled away. The angel of the Lord found her by the spring of water in the wilderness, and the spring of the way to Shur. And he said, Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going? That'll be made into a really popular song never mind. Sorry, bad joke. Where have you come from? Where are you going? She said, I am fleeing from my mistress Sarai. The angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit to her. The angel of the Lord said to her, I will surely multiply your offspring so that they cannot be numbered for multitude. And the angel of the Lord said to her, behold, you are pregnant and you will bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your affliction. He shall be a wild donkey of a man, and his hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand will be against him, and he will dwell over and against his kinsmen. Now this is historically, biblically significant, all right? Verse 12 says that Ishmael is going to be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand will be against him, and he will dwell over and against his kinsmen. This means that the descendants of Ishmael, who we'll meet in a couple of chapters, the descendants of Ishmael will always be against the descendants of Abraham. The descendants of Isaac, who is yet to come. They will always be at war with one another. And that not only that, but the descendants of Ishmael will be at war with everyone. They'll be against everyone. And we see that some of the descendants of Ishmael today are still at war with everyone. Verse 13. So she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, you are a God of seeing. This is one of my favorite names of God. It's El Roi. And anytime you see a name written in the Bible, most of the time, it depends on the translation. Sometimes they'll just write it out like this, El Roi. We see it down here, Be'er Lahai Roi. So a couple of things. Remember, well, I haven't told you this yet. I've already made these notes for later, but I'll tell you now. El, anytime you see El in the Bible like this, in the Old Testament, it's a reference to God. And then what's really interesting is any Hebrew word that ends with the letter I, like that, makes it personal. It's me, it's I. So El Roi is the God who sees me. Anytime a Hebrew word ends with I, it makes it personal like that. And so, anyway, I find that fascinating. You're the God of seeing. She's really saying you are God who sees me. It is one of my favorite names of God. When in 2004, 2004 was a particularly tough year for me. It's hard to believe now that that's been 20 years ago, but it was a tough year for me, just challenging in a couple of different ways. And this name of God was something that was particularly encouraging to me as I reminded myself that God still sees me, that he still knows who I am. So, verse 15, Hagar bore Abraham a son, and Abram called the name of his son, whom Hagar bore Ishmael, and Abraham was 86 years old when Ishmael was born. Now, we're going to skip 13 years. The Bible doesn't always do this for us. I wish that it did, because I love the timelines, I love the dates. But you'll notice that 16:16 ends with Abraham was 86 years old, and then 17:1, the very next verse says when Abraham was 99. So 13-year gap between these two chapters, very simple for us. When Abraham was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said, I am God Almighty, walk before me and be blameless, that I may make my covenant between me and you and may multiply you greatly. Then Abraham fell on his face. See, I told you I would do that. Abram fell on his face, and God said to him, behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be the father of a multitude of nations. This, by the way, this multitude of nations, we've talked about this before, but it's not just talking about the numbers and the volume of people. It's also talking about the Gentile inclusion in the promises of God and the covenant of God. It's not going to be just the nation of Israel that Abraham's the father of. Remember, we talked about in the last chapter, Abraham's the father of all who are of people of faith. We see that in Romans chapter 4. We see that in Galatians, that Abraham is the father of all who believe. And so the multitude of nations here is indicative of Revelation chapter 7, where it says there are people from every tribe and every tongue and every nation gathered around the throne of God. These are all sons and daughters of Abraham because they were made righteous by faith. So don't ignore this multitude of nations kind of thing. Verse 5, finally, no longer shall your name be Abram, but you shall be called Abraham. And now I can quit messing that up. For I have made you the father of a multitude of nations. And then there's that repetition of the multitude of nations. He says, I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make you into nations, and kings will come from you. We'll see this language repeated in Genesis. And I will establish my covenant between me and you and your offspring after you throughout your generations for an everlasting covenant to be God to you and your offspring. This is really important. I will establish my covenant with you and your offspring. God is going to make the same covenant that he made with Abraham. He's going to repeat it with Isaac, and then he's going to repeat it with Isaac's son, Jacob. And then what's really interesting is hundreds of years in the future, when Moses is about to bring the people into the promised land, I'll remind you of this when we get to Deuteronomy, but Moses, when he's leading the people into the promised land, he tells them in Deuteronomy 7, Deuteronomy 9, he says, don't think that you're going into the promised land because you're a bigger nation than any of the other nations. Don't think you're going into the promised land because you're righteous, because you're not righteous. You're stubborn and you're stiff-necked and you're wicked people. He said, you're going into the promised land because of a covenant I made with your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so this covenant here in verse 7 that he is reminding Abraham of, he made it in chapter 15, we're now in chapter 17. He's reminding Abraham of the covenant he made with them. He will repeat that covenant to Isaac and to Jacob, and God is faithful to his covenant, and that should give you and I as Christians incredible confidence, because the covenant that God has made with us through Christ, through faith in Christ, is that we are righteous and that we'll be saved, and God keeps his covenants. Okay, verse 8. And I will give to you and your offspring after you the land of your sojournings, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. God said to Abraham, as for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your offspring after you throughout their generations. This is my covenant which you shall keep between me and your offspring after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised. You shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskins, and it will be a sign of the covenant between me and you. Now, in chapter 15 yesterday, the covenant was ratified by laying animals in half over against each other, and Abraham and God passing through the halves to ratify this covenant. Now God says, hey, look, I want to make a covenant with you, and here's what I want you to do. I want you and all your men to be circumcised. That'll be the sign of this new covenant. And props to Abraham. The dude's 99 years old. He's 99 years old. He gets his 13-year-old son, and they get all the men in their camp, and he's like, guys, we've got plans today. We're going to have group circumcision, and golly, the covenant that God made with him at least 14 years earlier, at least that much earlier, they got to walk through pieces of animals, but now the blood that's going to be shed is going to be Abraham and his children and his servants. And I don't know, just That's wild. That is a wild symbol for a covenant. But it's super important, and I'm going to show you why. Verse 12 says, "He who is 8 days old among you shall be circumcised, every male throughout your generations, whether born in your house or bought with your money from any foreigner who is not your offspring. Both he and the one who is born in your house shall surely be circumcised. So shall my covenant be with your flesh, an everlasting covenant." In verse 14, super, super important. "Any uncircumcised male who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin shall be cut off because he has broken my covenant." Now, any Jew, any descendant of Abraham that is not circumcised in his flesh, in his body, his physical body, shall be cut off from the covenant of God. And so why does that matter? Because remember, in all of these things, we've already talked about this a little bit in our first week of doing this, that all of these things that have physical, practical, tangible kind of implications have higher spiritual implications. There is a higher truth. And the spiritual implication here is that in order to be part of the covenant people of God, for us even to be saved, there is a circumcision that happens. There is a removal of who we were without Christ. The Bible calls it in Colossians 2 and in Romans, it talks about the removal of your flesh, the circumcision of your flesh, the removal of that part of you that didn't belong to God. And when you came to God, who you were without God was removed. You've been made a new creature, 2 Corinthians 5:17 says. And so there's this idea, but here's what's beautiful about it. This idea of the circumcision not just being a circumcision of the physical skin of male genitalia, this idea in the Old Testament even, God presents that he's actually more concerned with the heart. That there would be a removal from the heart of the things that don't belong to God. And he calls that the circumcision of the heart, that the heart would be circumcised and that a piece of who you were would be removed so that you can come to God. So, for example, in Deuteronomy 10, Deuteronomy happens at the end of the 40-year Exodus in the wilderness, the journey, and Moses is reminding the people of the covenant with God. And in Deuteronomy 10, he tells them, you need to be circumcised in your heart. And you need to have your sin. You need to have the part of you that is not Christ-like removed or God-like removed. He's going to repeat that in Deuteronomy 30. In Jeremiah 4, he's going to say the same thing. Jeremiah 9, he says an interesting thing. He says that he will punish, and I might have this backwards, it might be Jeremiah 4, but Jeremiah 4 and 9 both speak to this. And he says, I will punish all of those, listen, who are circumcised only in their body and not circumcised in their heart. Because why? Because God is not concerned with the outward appearance. He's actually concerned with the heart. So this symbol of this covenant that Abraham made is just a symbol. What is God actually concerned with? Is he actually concerned with the circumcision of Abraham's physical bodily flesh? Ultimately, no. He's ultimately concerned with the circumcision of the heart, that there would be the removal of the things from the heart that don't belong to you, that don't belong to God. The Bible tells us, Jesus tells us in the New Testament, that it's not what a man eats, it's not what goes into his mouth and then into his stomach that defiles a man, it's what's in his heart that defiles a man. For out of a man's heart comes wickedness and all sorts of evil. And so what God is saying here when he establishes this covenant with Abraham, he is setting the precedent that there would be a removal of those things that don't belong to God so that we could belong to God. And so you and I as believers, we've been circumcised as well. We have received the circumcision of those things that don't belong to God. And golly, look, there's a lot more I want to say about this. I'll include a lot of the cross references in my blog notes so that you can look into this a little bit more. But this idea of God caring more about the heart than the outward expression, that's throughout the Bible, and it begins right here. And so verse 15, God said to Abraham, now I'm going to say Abram, golly. God said to Abraham, as for Sarai, your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. I will bless her, and moreover, I will give you a son by her. I will bless her, and she will become nations, and kings of peoples will come from her. There's that language again. Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said to himself, shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? Shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? And Abraham said to God, oh, that Ishmael would live before you. So Abraham's like, look, let Ishmael receive the blessing instead. Look at verse 19. God says, no, but Sarah, your wife shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant, and his offspring after him. As for Ishmael, I've heard you. Behold, I've blessed him. I will make him fruitful and multiply him greatly, and he will father 12 princes, and I will make him also into a great nation. But I will establish my covenant with Isaac, from whom Sarah shall bear you this time next year. That'll come up here again in a minute. So jump down to verse 24. Abraham was 99 years old and was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. Remember, it's more important that the heart be circumcised. And Ishmael, his son, was 13 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. And all the men of his house, those born in his house, those bought with his money, all were circumcised. And remember that what is more important than the physical demonstration of circumcision is the heart circumcision. And we'll see that in future text. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you tomorrow. Thank you so much for journeying with us today at Simpler Bible through another section of Scripture where we come to know and understand God a little bit better. Look, if you're brand new to Simpler Bible, we have all sorts of resources available for you. Go to our website, simplerbible.com, and there you can find these videos, you can find our podcast, you can find links to our social media, and you can even find a blog post with additional scriptures if you want to go into a little bit more study than we had time to cover in this podcast and video today. We hope that this tool will be exactly that for you, a tool. Not something that replaces your daily walk with God, but something that enhances your daily walk with God and helps you to know and enjoy Him more. Thank you so much for being part of this, and we'll see you again tomorrow.